Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to Ask Zajef Xilonen. As usual for the Ask Zajef videos, I start by talking about the overall place of a character in the meta, and then I start taking questions from chat. If you want to ask one of your questions and have that be included in the video, make sure you keep an eye out for the community posts I make, or just come check out the stream nonetheless, because you're a nice, kind viewer of mine. True. So, let's just get right into it. Xilonen is very much a meta character. She is a character who is used very, very often by many people. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense. The buffs that she provides are very, very versatile. She provides resistance shred and damage percent, and while they're not omni shred, it doesn't shred every single thing, and they're also not omni buffs that buff every single thing, the elements that she shreds and buffs are decided by what's in your party, which means that most of the time she is shredding and buffing the elements that you want to shred or buff when she's in your party. Xilonen is basically Vivi but better, in the sense that she provides shred to the same elements that can be buffed or that can be shredded by the Viridescent Venom set: Hydro, Pyro, Electro, Cryo. And the amount that she shreds when you crown her skill talent is 36%, which is 4% less than Viridescent Venom, but honestly it's close enough to pretty much be the same. But she can also shred Geo, and on top of that, it lasts longer, and you don't need to trigger a specific reaction to get the shred. What that means is that in most situations, if you're comparing Xilonen to a random Animo character on VV, Xilonen will give you better results. She can use the Cinder City set because she's an Atlan character, or if you already have Cinder City on your team, she can use Instructor or Petra. And unlike a lot of other characters, her personal stats do not matter, which means there's no real downside to using Instructor and getting a 4-star stat line instead of a 5-star stat line. Because of that, in teams where you don't already have someone else on Cinder City, she's giving you 40% damage. And in teams where you do have someone else on Cinder City, she can still give you something from the artifact set. Compare that to Citlali Eonsan, for example. When you play both of them in the same team, it's kind of hard to change their artifacts because they're so reliant on the energy generated from the 2-piece Cinder City set that changing their artifact set to something else can create pretty big energy problems for either of them. Because Xilonen's burst is not important to her buffs, she's not affected by that. The fact that her buff isn't reliant on triggering a specific reaction also means that it works against enemies that have an innate aura. For example, this current Abyss has the Hydrotulpa. If you try to bring VV against the Hydrotulpa, right, do something with this. My E hits for 11k. Still 11k after using my skill on Kazuha. Even if you get a Pyro Absorption on his skill, in order to trigger Swirl, you need to apply Animo to an enemy that has Pyro on them, and the Hydrotulpa has a Hydro Aura that you cannot remove. It's always affected by Hydro, which means you can't trigger Pyro Swirl on it. There's technically ways to fix that. Right, 14k from Globa's Shred plus EM buff on Sucrose. Oops, not what I want to do, but whatever. Of course, we f***ing got a crit. 17k. You can trigger Swirl on things that are not enemies. You can trigger Swirl on yourself with Jean's self-Animo application. You can trigger Swirl on the things that can have auras on them, like Guoba, who applies Pyro to itself when it breathes fire, and who can be hit by certain Animo abilities. But that requires additional setup, and it forces you to use very specific Animo and Pyro characters to get that. Xilonen just always gets her shred, as long as you don't have 3 unswirlable characters in your team. That makes her versatile in team building, but also versatile in terms of situations. She's pretty much always going to be able to provide the things she's supposed to provide. And then on top of that, they've been putting the Secret Source Automaton in Abyss all the time lately, and Xilonen provides you with a way to climb the pillars without having to do the annoying setups like with short characters to try to climb them without special abilities. It's whatever. Anyways, all of this to say, she's a very, very versatile characters. On the other hand, there are not that many teams where the things, or where she is providing the largest possible available buff. And from the sort of characters and supports they've released lately, I expect that number of teams to go down with time. When it comes to teams where she is part, or an important part of the team that is difficult to replace, nowadays, there are not that many characters that actually rely on her. Mavuika relies on her to some extent, but Xianyun's release has given her some other options that are sometimes better than Xilonen. And because Xianyun is a 4-star, just getting one copy of her already creates a situation for you where if you don't have Xilonen, it's not really that big of a deal. And if you get multiple copies of Xianyun, it can even be better than Xilonen. If you have both, Xilonen is still very much usable and sometimes preferable to Xianyun, but Xianyun's release does make it so that a character like Xilonen is a bit less appealing in terms of full value, because it's not like you need Xilonen to be able to make your team function. Other than that, characters that currently rely relatively heavily on Xilonen for their best teams are arguably Neuvillette, Mualani, Grizzly, the Geo carries, sure, Ito Noel, Navia, and Lyney. Neuvillette, currently his best team uses Xilonen, but the main reason for that is because HP buffs are very rare, and we don't really have any characters that provides Hydro-specific buffs. Right now, we have Chevreuse that provides Pyro and Electro buffs to Overload teams. We have Xianyun that provides Plunge-specific buffs. We have Varesa that provides Anemo-specific buffs. Silali that provides Melt buffs. Technically, she provides Hydro buffs, but they're a lot worse than the Melt buffs. We have Sucrose that gives EM buffs. But in terms of Hydro character-focused stuff, because Neuvillette doesn't really work too well in Forward Vape, he doesn't really have any buffers that are dedicated to the sort of teams he's often played in. And because of a lack of niche-specific supports that work with him, all that's left is the generic ones. And out of the generic ones, Xilonen is arguably the best one, which is why she's played in his teams. If you followed leaks at all, you might be aware of Escoffier's upcoming release, and Escoffier is a character who provides Hydro-specific buffs, Hydro and Cryo-specific, to freeze teams. And Escoffier's release is going to knock Xilonen out of Neuvillette's best team. It won't make that team completely irrelevant, but it is going to make it so that Neuvillette's best team is not one that uses Xilonen anymore. Mualani, the biggest reason why Xilonen is quite good for her is because it's often difficult to get a Hydro Swirl right before you swap to her, because in order to get a Hydro Swirl, the enemy needs to have a Hydro Aura, but if you've already deployed your off-field Pyro, it's harder for the enemy to have a Hydro Aura, which means most of the time, if you are using VV units, because of the short duration of VV, you have to swirl before you swap to your Pyro unit, because otherwise they won't have a Hydro Aura on them, and then by the time you swap to Mualani, you're already at half VV uptime remaining, so you end up getting 2 buffed chomps instead of all 3, and if your chomps are slightly slowed down by enemies moving or you getting hit, you only get 1 chomp that gets the VV buff. With Xilonen, that doesn't happen. You don't have to deal with that because the buff lasts long enough that you'll get all your chomps buffed without too much of a problem. On top of that, Mualani's teams actually often struggle to run a dedicated healer, and so the fact that Xilonen is a character that has healing in her kit makes Mualani teams much more comfortable to play. Mualani, unlike a lot of other characters, can't really dodge. Using a dash on Mualani while you're surfing eats like half of your Night Soul, and it makes you lose 1, maybe even 2 chomps. Which means, while you can move in a specific direction if the attack doesn't have a particularly big AoE, move behind the enemy, say, not every attack can be dodged that way, which means there's going to be some unavoidable damage with her, which makes her a bit more reliant on defensive options than other characters, even though she's an HP scaler and will be tankier. When it comes to healing options that work well in Mualani's teams, there's just honestly not that many, with the main ones being Baiju in her Burn Vape teams and Xilonen in general. And because of that, while if you look at the best Mualani teams, the ones that don't run Xilonen aren't necessarily that much worse, in practice, because of both the reliability of her longer uptime and because of the healing, playing Mualani without Xilonen is often kind of a disaster. I'd say that nowadays, Mualani is the only character who actually still somewhat heavily relies on Xilonen. I think if you have Baiju, you're fine without Xilonen, but no one has Baiju. And if you're gonna pull for a healer for a Mualani team, you'd much rather go Xilonen than Baiju. Potentially a good idea. I guess it's not necessarily the only one. There's also the Geo carries, Ito, Noelle, Navia. It's mostly Ito, honestly. Ito's lack of healer options prevents him from being played without Farina, or with Farina, and Farina works very well in Geo teams. So Xilonen being a healer is a pretty big deal for him. Because Noelle is a healer herself, she's a bit less reliant on that healing and can more easily justify running a triple Geo team with like Goro +1 instead of a Xilonen team. Xilonen is still better, but you'll get less personal damage from Noelle in a team like that and more damage from the rest of your team. So if you're Noelle main specifically and you really like Noelle, it might not be what you want to do. And then with Navia, it's pretty good, but Navia has a lot of options that are pretty decent, so it's not quite as necessary. Though if you're playing Navia with Mavuika, Xilonen is a lot better than the alternatives because Xilonen provides fighting spirit for Mavuika. Other than that, Lyney teams also appreciate the longer buff up time from Xilonen. The fact that you can get your Xilonen buff before you swap to Bennett means that you have more Bennett uptime on Lyney, which is quite nice. If you're using VV instead, you have to get your VV after Bennett because the duration of VV is even shorter than the duration of Bennett's buff, which is gonna make it so you effectively get one less Lyney charge shot before your buffs run out. But Lyney's not necessarily that reliant on Xilonen because, especially at high investment Lyney stuff, you won't necessarily need to get that last charge shot to kill the enemy. And if you don't, then the fact that Xilonen allows you to get one more charge shot before your buffs run out won't do anything. And when it comes to the other carries, stuff like Clorinde, for example, Xilonen is good with Clorinde, but not so good to make the Quicken teams better than the Overload teams. And so you're still better off not using Xilonen because Xilonen prevents Shower's passive from working. For pretty much every other Pyro character outside of Mavuika, there's a similar issue going, Pyro and Electro. The ones that work well in reactions, so Hu Tao, Arlecchino, Daming, I guess Yoimiya. For Yoimiya and Arlecchino, the reaction teams aren't necessarily better, or at least much better than the Overload teams, and even when they are, you're not necessarily as reliant on Xilonen because with Arlecchino, her damage is so front-loaded that losing a bit of VV uptime at the end of your rotation isn't really that big of a deal, which means she works a bit better with VV. With Yoimiya, her personal damage is like kind of cooked. End up wheelchairing her, or you play her in a Chevreuse team anyways. Because her personal damage is a little cooked, she ends up often seeing better results in an overvape team with Fischl versus a traditional vape team. And so while Xilonen can be good for them, she's far from necessary for their team building. Then both Gaming and Hu Tao have Xilonen as one of the options for their best teams, right? Hu Tao's default best teams being Hu Tao, Farina, Hydro, either Yelena or Singso, and then healer. Xilonen is arguably the best healer here, but she's very, very similar to Xianyun, and not that much worse than a High Constellation Bennett. Or sorry, not that much better than a High Constellation Bennett. And so while she's good, she's not necessary. Gaming teams, the vape teams, tend to really want to use Xianyun. Even the ones that don't use Xianyun, if you're not using Xianyun, you're probably doing double Hydro. You can do Xilonen here, but it'll be noticeably worse. If you're doing the Melt teams, on the other hand, if you're doing something like this with your flex slot here, Xilonen is one of the available options. She's not better than Xianyun, but she is more flexible and often more comfortable to play. However, she's not the only alternative to Xianyun. Yeonsan is also a pretty good alternative to Xianyun. Rosaria is a pretty good alternative. Diona is a pretty good alternative if you have Diona's C6. Which means, again, she's one of your options, but far from necessary. And outside of Mualani and maybe the Geo characters, that's something you'll notice very, very often. Xilonen is almost always one of your options, but very rarely the best one. And even when she is, outside of the Geo and Mualani teams, it's not by much. Which means if you're looking to specifically upgrade a team that you have, let's say I'm looking to specifically improve my, let's say this is my current Neuvillette team. What is going to upgrade my team more between getting Xilonen or getting a signature weapon or constellation for one of these characters? And the answer to that is getting a signature weapon or constellation for one of these characters by a pretty long shot. And that'll be the same for, honestly, most, if not all, of these. Even on Mualani, getting a signature weapon or constellation is likely gonna do more. Maybe the only ones where that net won't be the case are the ones that have really bad signature weapons or constellations. Maybe like Ito. His Sig is pretty good, but so is Serpent Spine, so if you have Serpent Spine, it might just be better to get Xilonen. Or maybe Gaming. So Xilonen effectively is a character that, if you're looking to specifically upgrade one of your teams, is almost never going to be the best way to spend your Primogems. However, if upgrading one of your teams is not what you're looking for, if what you're looking for is a way to make your account more versatile and more ready to tackle on abysses that counter and encourage different types of teams, then Xilonen can be a pretty good pickup. Personally, I went for Xilonen without having to think about it too much, and I don't regret it. She is a character I end up playing fairly often, and because I like going for a lot of different characters, and because I want to test a lot of characters in a lot of their available teams, because Xilonen is almost always at least one of the available teams, if I didn't get her, I'd have to borrow an account like 3 times more often than I currently do. And so for me, Xilonen was a pickup that I didn't have to think much about, and I am far from regretting. But just because that's what happened for me doesn't necessarily mean it'll be the same for you. If you're someone who really likes Kanich, for example, one of your teams is Kanich, say with Mavuika, and you really like Varesa, and your other team is this, Xilonen won't make your 2 teams, even if you get her. Even if you're playing a character who can potentially make one of your teams, like Neuvillette, if you know for a fact that you will always be playing your Neuvillette and that your other side doesn't need Xilonen, because, say, you're playing the Kanich team, Xilonen might not be a better pickup than getting a signature or constellation. She also might not be a better pickup than the upcoming Escoffier. The reason why I talk about Xilonen often not necessarily being the best character for a lot of different carries is because your Primogem income is limited if you don't spend any money in this game, which you shouldn't. Don't spend money on this shit game, true. And with a limited Primogem income, feeling like you have to go for a specific character because everyone touts them as the best character in the game, the most versatile support, whatever, effectively means that you'll have less Primos to go for the characters you want, the characters that you want because you just like them specifically, or even the characters that you want because they're good for the carries you like playing. And Xilonen is almost never a character that's good specifically for the carries you like playing, with a few exceptions that I've already mentioned. As much as I'm a meta player, and I pull with a very heavy emphasis on meta, not everyone who cares about meta will necessarily want to pull for the strongest meta characters. And I think it's very important to provide a point of view that isn't just focused on the goal of creating the strongest 2 possible teams in the game. I think it's important to remind people that if you like a specific carry and you want to play them, you will probably enjoy yourself more if you pull for characters that work in those teams specifically than if you just pull for a character because everyone says they're good. Even if they are good, if you don't end up using them, who cares how good they are? In any case, in terms of pull value, she is definitely one of the best characters to pull because there aren't that many accounts that won't use Xilonen if they pull her. The question is just, will she improve your teams more than a different character would? And often the answer to that is no. So you should take that into consideration when you're deciding whether or not you go for her. I think that does it for her overall strength and pull value. So I think it's time to start taking questions directly from chat. Would I have a noticeable DPS increase for C2 Arlecchino if I decided to pull Xilonen? No. When it comes to just the amount of damage that you do on Arlecchino in a reaction team, so your first attack on Arlecchino, 172k here. Alright, so around 170k with Xilonen with my current gear. First attack here, 230k. Just in terms of your screenshot damage in a melt team, you get significantly more using Sucrose than pretty much anything else. At C2 on Arlecchino, you get an additional massive hit as part of your front-loaded damage, which is going to be something that happens while you're still buffed by Sucrose, both with VV and the like 200 something EM she provides. Because of that, you will often get better results using Sucrose than using Xilonen with a C2 Arlecchino. Outside of melt teams, there's also vape teams. In vape teams, your VV setups tend to be a bit harder to do, and so there's a bit more of a reason to use Xilonen. Other than that, there's the mono pyro teams and the Chaveurs teams. Obviously, Xilonen won't work in Chaveurs. And in mono pyro, if not for Xilonen, your options for the last slot are a bit more limited. And with a high constellation Arlecchino, you would much rather focus on her personal damage than use a character like Channeling that has personal damage themselves. And so Xilonen is a pretty good addition to this team here. So it basically just depends on which Arlecchino teams you're playing. How good is she for Varesa Farina teams if I don't have Xianyun? Just worse than Overload? Pretty significantly worse than Overload, yeah. Oh, Xianyun is already worse than Overload, although not by that much. And Xilonen is quite a bit worse than Xianyun for multiple reasons. Number one of the advantages that Xilonen provides is better uptime. But in a Varesa team, there's no downside to swapping out of Varesa, which means you can go refresh your VV if you need to. So that better uptime doesn't really matter. The next is the numbers. The numbers are better with Xianyun. And the last one is that your default combo with Xilonen in a full rotation unfortunately includes charge attacks, which are annoying as to do. One of the nicest things that Xianyun provides to Varesa teams is the ability to get the plunges that you would otherwise need charge attacks for just by jumping. And because Varesa's charge attack is so slow and clunky, it feels so much better to play. Right? Because if you don't do charge attacks, you just look at a default rotation with Xilonen on a Varesa team. If I swamp out after this attack here, I have like 2 seconds of cooldown left on my Farina skill, a little bit more than that, which means you either lose 2 seconds staring at the enemy or you have to add charge attacks into your rotation. Obviously, it's better to do the latter. With Xianyun, you can just do those with normal jump plunges and swap back to Farina pretty much exactly after 20 seconds. Well, I don't have a single attack main stat right now, and I'm not on TDDS. You might as well show the actual damage you do so that people can internalize the damage difference for themselves a bit better. Although, to be fair, I have C1, which makes Xianyun a bit worse. Whatever. And there's also the fact that we're getting a bit less value from Xianyun on the first rotation because we don't have as much HP to heal because we're already close to full health. But yeah, so for Varesa, it's fine. If you don't have Chaveurs and you don't have Xianyun, you can use Xilonen. But honestly, you only need 1 copy of Chaveurs to make Xilonen not part of Varesa's best teams on your account. If New Abyss has 3 teams, will Xilonen be better now since some carries might have their support stolen by other teams? So we have had slightly sus leaks of a new endgame mode coming in the future, and it will have 3 teams instead of 2. If that is true, it will be a pretty important factor when it comes to deciding how to build your teams. And it'll make Xilonen a bit better. Obviously, the more teams you have to play at the same time, the more characters you have to use, and if you are using carries that have overlap in their best teams, then Xilonen being available as a potential replacement will be nice. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you always will use her. Personally, once that comes out, since I'm planning on getting Escoffier, the default teams I'll do will probably be Varesa, Yansan, Chaveurs, there's Mavuika, Neuvillette, Citlali, Escoffier, Farina, and then Nahida, Raiden, Singto, Yelan. Which means Xilonen will not be doing shit. Why not Mavuika melt? Because Varesa is fun, and I like playing Varesa. I can also play Mavuika, and if I do, then I probably do end up using Xilonen. I'm not taking Yansan away here. Anyways, so yeah, Xilonen will be helping you, but she won't necessarily be impactful. It'll depend on which characters you use and whether they want Xilonen or not. And it'll depend on whether the carries you have any overlap in their teams. What would be the best triple Geo carry Xilonen with Goro team if I really like her and hate myself that much? Definitely Farina. I'm not sure what the last slot is. It's probably Chiori. Does Goro's burst count as a construct for Chiori? I don't actually know. I forgot. No? Oh, and you don't get healing from ult. I forgot you don't get the healing either. Oh, man. So I guess the best option is not a Geo unit. It's probably just Xianyun. Or you can do quad Geo, yeah, with like Chiori, Zhongli, or Chiori Albedo. How ass is this? Let's pretend the last 20 seconds didn't happen. Would you suggest getting Xilonen or any generic support for newer players who don't know in what teams they want to invest? Yeah, Xilonen I think is a lot more impactful on new accounts than she is on older accounts. I'm planning to get C2 Mavuika. Does Bennett really become useless and Xilonen is better? No. Let's look at the amount of damage you gain from Bennett's buff. This is the amount of damage Xilonen gains from Bennett at C0 with Sig. This is the amount of damage Xilonen gains from Bennett at C2 with Sig. Actually, that's not true. The C1 also changes things a little. Sorry. But 42 is still more than Xilonen. Xilonen is still good, because especially at C2, you will pretty much always be killing the enemies with initial hit of burst. So front-loading the fighting spirit is going to be nice. Like, Bennett is a little bit less powerful with C2 Mavuika, but he's not bad at all. Actually, wait. I forgot the C6. Sorry. This is the buff you're getting. Anyways, yeah, exactly. He's still him. What's the DPS difference in a Xianyun team and Xilonen in Gaming Melt? If you do your setups well, Xianyun is noticeably better, but in practice, most of the time, the Xianyun setups are scuffed as all hell. So I tend to prefer Xilonen anyways. I'll show you what the technical best setup for Xianyun in a Gaming team is, okay? So you can start with an optional Gaming E at the start if you need the energy, but it's basically gonna be Xianyun EQ. Oh, hell, right, this is a Hydro-infused enemy, whatever. Bennett EQ, Xianyun normal book the swap cooldown, Citlali, EQ, and then Gaming. This is the technical best setup for a Gaming Xianyun team. If you don't book the swap cooldown, you lose Bennett buff on one of your plunges. So oh, I got staggered. Whatever. Getting staggered made me lose VV on one of the plunges. With Xilonen, begging Citlali, please be nice to me. I didn't pick up the Petra. We picked up the Petra. Right? We do about as much damage on a plunge as the plunges that are not VV buffed with Xianyun. But you have one more character on your team that needs energy, which means when you kill enemies early, your next chamber feels like ass. That's honestly the biggest upside of using Xilonen. Is Xilonen the best last slot on mono teams? It depends. In mono teams where it's not really a mono team, it's just like one carry with Bennett and a couple buffers, yeah, Xilonen is the best slot here. If you're doing an actual mono team, something like this though, generally I'd say Kazuo has a bit better, but Xilonen is more versatile because against enemies like Tulpa, you still get your shred. Can you go over the teams where her Sig is better than Fav? Sure. Her Sig is almost always better than Fav, but the question is just by how much. What you get from the Sig is a little bit over 25 damage percent. What you get from Fav is energy particles that lower your ER requirements. Lower ER requirements means that your artifacts can have more attack crit because they don't need as much ER. The only teams where Fav is doing very little are teams that have like a lot of particle generation, like Neuvillette teams. In a Neuvillette team, the effect of Peak Patrol is going to be pretty much at its best. Or maybe in a Mavuika team where your carry doesn't need ER, or an Arlecchino team, where your carry doesn't need ER, it's just your supports that do, and you have a lot of energy on your Citlali and your bennett. No Fav on a team like this can actually make your ER requirements too high on bennett or Citlali, but Peak Patrol plus Skyward is better than Fav plus Aquila. But Peak Patrol is pretty much never better than getting a Constellation or a Sig weapon on your carry. And that's gonna be it for the Xilonen Ask Zajef. I hope you learned a thing or two. And as usual, do the YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.